Hello and welcome to Revision Tips for SIPS Level 5, Advanced Diploma in Procurement and Supply. This is Module 5, Managing Ethical Procurement and Supply, and it's Learning Outcome 2, which is to understand and be able to analyse the importance of compliance with the standards to achieve ethical and sustainable supply chains. So we look at the complexity in supply chains and how they impact on compliance, how contractual terms can support compliance with standards for sustainability, the use of third-party organisations to promote compliance, and how to critically assess how relationships with suppliers should deal with infringements. Now, supply chain mapping is the first exercise really to try and track goods from the raw material right through to the finished product. So the diagram on the slides on the screen right now shows a basic supply chain map. And in order for you to map a supply chain, you need quality data from your key suppliers, such as compliance, risk and performance. And you can gather this from your suppliers if they've got it, or you can do an audit. So what you've got in the middle is the OEM, and OEM is an official or original equipment manufacturer. This OEM is a company that manufactures and sells products directly to the consumer market. So somebody like Apple is a great example. And in the automotive industry, an OEM would be a term used for replacement parts manufactured by the original manufacturer. Now, Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers refer primarily to suppliers of the automotive industry. A Tier 1 supplier sells products, mostly parts, directly to the OEM. In some cases, a part manufactured by both Tier 1 and Tier 2, depending on who they're supplying parts to. But supply chain tiers go beyond Tier 2 and lead all the way back to the raw material supplier. And supply chain mapping allows for a full supply chain visibility. It requires you to engage with all of your suppliers in all tiers, and that can be very complex and likely to involve many suppliers around the world. And you can connect them in many different ways. But a detailed supply chain map will document everything, including the exact source of every material, every step or action taken to produce the goods, every shipment involved in bringing the goods to market. So mapping supply chains helps organisations to identify and be transparent about where the raw materials and products required for their finished goods come from. Simple, effective, shorter supply chains can help organisations more easily trace the source of raw materials back to each producer. And that ensures compliance, which can be an onerous task. But during the data gathering stage, you should be able to trace whether its suppliers are complying with the codes of conduct and ethical sustainable standards. Now, tools that can be used to map supply chains include integrated definition or integrated programming, a program used to obtain knowledge of suppliers across the supply chain. The SCORES model stands for Supply Chain Operational Reference, a model for business process mapping. And then value stream mapping, a tool for analysing. So let's start by looking at integrated definition. It was developed for aerospace batch manufacturing in the US Air Force, and based on the premise that interdisciplinary thinking and synergistic collaboration of disciplines can solve complex problems, open new frontiers, and lead to true innovation and breakthroughs, the cornerstone of industrial competitiveness and advancement of society. So the programme was conducted because Air Force studies had indicated that while saving from individual applications of CAM are substantial, the major benefits will come through the integration of individually developed subsystems that, according to the plan, combines them in a manageable system. One of the first major products within a programme will apply commercially, and it's available to industrial robots, to aerospace for batch manufacturing. So the SCORE model, the Supply Chain Operational Reference model. This is a management tool that's used to address, improve, and communicate supply chain management decisions within a company and within its suppliers and customers. So it describes the business process required to satisfy a customer demand, but it helps to explain the processes used along the entire supply chain and provides a basis for how to improve these processes. The SCORE model was developed by the Supply Chain Council with the assistance of 70 of the world-leading manufacturing companies. It's been described as the most promising model for supply chain strategic decision-making because it illustrates business concepts of process re-engineering, benchmarking, and measurement into its framework. The framework focuses on 5 areas of the supply chain. You've got the plan, source, make, deliver, and return. These areas repeat again and again along the supply chain. And the Supply Chain Council says that the process spans from the supplier's suppliers to the customer's customers. And the value stream mapping process will allow you to create a detailed visualization of all steps in a work process. It's a representation of the flow of goods from supplier to customer through the organization. A value stream map puts in display all the important steps of the work process that's necessary to deliver value from start to finish. It allows organizations to visualize every task that the team works on and provide single glance status about the progress of each assignment. The primary purpose of creating a value stream map is to show the places where organizations can improve processes by visualizing both its value add and its wasteful steps. Now, procurement will need to build a spectrum of relationships with their suppliers depending on the risk, spend, and duration involved. An appropriate relationship will then be established based on the risks and spend. These may include adversarial arm's length, transactional, closer tactical, single sourcing, outsourcing, strategic alliances, partnerships, or co-density, which is what you can see on the screen. You know, it's a spectrum that goes from very much hands-off, short-term, low trust, and very close communication, all the way up to the collaborative, long-term, high-trust, open communication. There are situations where the trouble and expense of developing a long-term collaborative relationship is simply not justified. If the product has little or no strategic importance to the buyer, then a simple transactional model is appropriate. The aim of partnerships is to encourage businesses to recognize the potential benefits from adopting a philosophy of win-win, where both parties are in the relationship to gain knowledge and work together. But no one relationship is best. Procurement must also take into account upstream risks in the supply network associated with the supplier or their suppliers. And CrowdRisk analysis has been used for many years to establish these risks and formulate strategies to counter them. So it aims to remove supply vulnerability as such that it's possible to maximize potential buying power. And the CrowdRisk matrix helps us to determine on a per product, per category, or per supplier basis the type of relationship we should be fostering with each of our suppliers. The model works by mapping the profit impact of the product on one axis and the upstream risk associated with the product or supplier on the other. We've discussed the importance of knowing and understanding an organisation's suppliers across the whole supply chain. But what happens if suppliers needing to bring in other parties to fulfill your organisation requirements? In this situation, the supplier will bring in a subcontractor. Subcontractors are independent contractors, not employees of the main contractor, and they're brought in by suppliers to fulfill requirements. So, for example, in the construction industry, the main contractor will use subcontractors for roofing, plumbing, electrical, and other services. Subcontractors can also further subcontract some of their services. So having subcontractors can create risks, which must be monitored carefully. When mapping a supply chain, it's important to identify the different subcontractors as well as their tiers in the supply chain. Reasonable due care and attention must be applied to ensure that the subcontractor and suppliers at all levels are complying with the buying organisation's code of conduct, ethical standards, sustainability standards, and some questions to ask to help determine how far the supply chain or how far down the supply chain the subcontractor mapping needs to go are things such as, does the organisation have any leverage at the lower levels or tiers? Is it possible to identify significant risks at that lower level of the supply chain? And is the supply chain consistent, or does it change significantly between suppliers? So value chain mapping is a process that goes into a little bit more detail than supply chain mapping. It looks at activities in the supply chain to identify the main actions associated with the making of a product or service, from the raw material to the end user. And a value chain map illustrates graphically all the components and relationships between them. The selected value chain. It's a visual tool that helps us to understand how a particular industry works. Value chain maps demonstrate how a product in an industry moves from the raw material through production, processing, and other steps until it eventually winds up with the final customer. But the map highlights the range of activities that occur within that value chain and the transformation steps or functions, relationships, and support services. The level of detail in a value chain map can vary, ranging from nothing, just the basic elements, to a highly comprehensive structure. And at the end of the design process, a second version of the map can be developed in detail of the future vision of the market that the program will create. So the main purpose of mapping the value chain is to summarize graphically the value structure. There are several ways to go about charting the value chain. You can do horizontally, vertically, or circular. Whichever program the designer chooses, the components remain the same. And what you can see on the screen is a hypothetical value chain for cocoa. So in order for the measurement, reporting, and communication of sustainability to occur effectively and systematically, organisations must establish and maintain indicators. And this includes regularly monitoring from various forms of sustainability, guiding the development of specific information that the businesses ought to measure and communicate externally. In 2012, Harvard Business School and the London Business School looked at data from 16 countries that have adopted some level of corporate sustainability reporting and compared those of 42 countries that had not. While much of their analysis focused on the impact of social and environmental factors, they found that for companies that began to measure and report sustainable practices, adapted closer communication and collaboration, resulting in a significant decline in energy use and waste and water. And they also found that corporate sustainability reporting does affect management practice. Now, in an age where multinational supply chains crisscross the globe, companies need to monitor and disclose not just their own direct economic, environmental, social impacts, but also those of their suppliers. To help reporting organisations meet rising expectations in this area, Global Reporting Initiative guidelines include updated supply chain disclosures, which require organisations to assess and report on significant impacts in the supply chain. The disclosures, which focus on environmental, labour, human rights and social impacts, can be applied by all organisations, no matter the size or extent of their supply chain. And to achieve improvements in relation to these aspects, organisations can make use of the supply chain mapping, benchmarking and audits to make a difference. Now, CSR contractual terms are required to make sure that all parties are aware of their CSR obligations, and these can be enforced if the terms are breached. But not all contractual terms are legally binding. Examples of contractual terms that can support sustainability in relation to social, environmental and economic aspects will include communities, employers, employees, the investors, the customers, the planet and our suppliers. The effective sourcing of raw materials and the appropriate pricing and payment terms need to be established in order to sustain the supply chain. And terms that reward CSR performance and give the supplier a clear indication of what will be satisfactory in terms of performance are there so they have an incentive to achieve expected levels of service. A general CSR clause that states that the supplier has implemented and will conduct business in accordance with the CSR values and principles and the codes of conduct. But it should also state that in complying with the CSR laws and regulations, that it's required that all subcontractors and sub-suppliers also comply with CSR laws and regulations. And voluntary sustainability standards are an innovative market-based approach to promoting sustainable production and business practices. And the adoption of these sustainability standards are intended to be voluntary. The standards are not created, run, or required by governments or any government regulation. Instead, voluntary sustainability standards are non-government initiatives that seek to drive sustainable production and consumption by creating market demand for sustainable products and a supply to meet that demand. They help buyers identify sustainably produced products, and they guide producers, managers, operators, and factory owners and others in the choice of sustainable practices. A growing bulk of regulations and laws involved in push companies towards greater transparency and cut out social and environmental impacts, with progressive companies tending to stay ahead of regulations. In 2014, the European Commission introduced its non-financial reporting directive, which under large companies have to publish reports on the policies they implement in relation to environmental protection, social responsibility, treatment of employees, respect of human rights, anti-corruption and bribery. And India became the first country to legislate sustainability measures. And due to hypervigilance caused by concerns over the environment, the importance of sustainability is being highlighted through compliance. Mandatory compliance ensures all companies disclose their sustainability information. Raise awareness creates an environment for innovation and change. But on the other hand, it's difficult to develop a framework that defines the sustainability issues facing every company. Once compliance becomes mandatory, stakeholders may become complacent and move on to the next concern. A poorly developed mandatory framework may become a simple tick box exercise that does not incentivize the company to improve. This could remove the incentive to do so. Forcing disclosure affects transparency, and due to the differences in approach to sustainability, it would be difficult to compare the data. Now, suppliers' performance against sustainability KPIs must be monitored and managed throughout the contract. You can build collaborative relationships with key suppliers and strategic suppliers, and that's to form a resilient supply chain that can cope with the challenges presented by an increased global population. You can gather and share information to establish how companies across the supply chain are undertaking CSR activities. And look at the long-term impact of these global challenges. Put strategies in place to consider sustainable materials and recycling programs. Build an effective, streamlined supply chain to make monitoring CSR performance easier to manage. These contractual terms can support sustainability. Community benefit clauses are contractual clauses which can be included to build a range of economic, social and environmental conditions into the delivery of public contracts. So community benefit clauses can be viewed as contracting to the best value and sustainable procurement agendas and allow organisations to contribute to the achievement of outcomes which benefit their communities by specifying contractual requirements which seek to deliver wider social benefits. Corporate social responsibility clauses are common features in contracts between buyers and suppliers. Yet the vague language of the majority of these clauses suggests limited effectiveness in actually bringing about sustainable practices. Let's look at some of the commercial clauses. They can include a letter of intent which formalises the ongoing discussions and records what's been agreed before legal enforcement is drawn up. You can look at alternative dispute resolution, and that can be included in contracts about how disputes will be dealt with. Payment in advance, letter of credit, via banks, following performance, and paid when paid. That's a construction clause. Jurisdiction relates to the geographical area over which legal authority of the court extends. Using something like time is of the essence is an obligation that becomes a condition in the contract, and if breach entitles the innocent party to terminate the contract and claim damage. But you could say sustainability is of the essence. Retention of title. The seller keeps title of ownership until payment is received in full. And then you've got expressed and implied terms. Buyers can develop a number of strategic programs to help suppliers improve their sustainability performance. Through reward, these programs cover the assessment of supplier sustainability performance, management of regulated substances, and improvement of working conditions and responsible sourcing initiatives. An organisation should obtain feedback from their suppliers and use it for the basis of improvement. You can build trust and transparency in relationships so suppliers are not reluctant to share information. You can ask suppliers to complete risk assessments. Audit suppliers classified as high risk to check for compliance. Where non-compliance is identified, ensure that suppliers take action to address it. Many organisations will value the openness of suppliers that advise them on non-compliance and that take corrective action of the situation rather than waiting for it to be detected. And work with suppliers while they're addressing non-compliance issues rather than terminating the relationship or removing the supplier from the list. Internally focused initiatives and external compliance are not sufficient to ensure sustainability. You need to think about the impact and opportunities of products across the supply chain. To achieve this requires working with supply chain partners in a collaborative and structured way, using sustainability as a focus for dialogue and improvement, rather than a focus on cost and service levels. There are benefits for both buying companies and suppliers through feedback from suppliers about sustainability. Now, when communicating with suppliers in general, you might be negotiating or providing feedback, but you need to use an effective communication model. So the first thing you should do is focus and attend. So listen to what the supplier's representative is saying, but also consider their body language and eye contact. Ensure they're also listening to you and talking in specific points you raise or feedback you supply. The second is to acknowledge. Show you're hearing what the other party is saying with a nod. This shows that focus and attention is being maintained. The third, to clarify, is to ask questions and request more details to ensure communication is open. This reduces the risks of misinterpretation in both sides. And then respond. Respond to what the other has said. Feedback situation. The buyer may outline the action that the supplier needs to take. A supplier code of conduct is created for the purpose of ensuring that a company's suppliers puts into place safe working conditions and their employees are treated with respect, but also their production process being responsible and environmentally friendly. Components of a supplier code of conduct would include labour practices and standards, such as safeguards against child labour, non-discrimination, health and safety, working conditions and hours, the compensation and the rights to association, and that employment is freely chosen. And then the environmental policy, comprising of products and materials used and technology to transport them. Then the ethics, understanding any anti-corruption measures and adhering to fair business practices in winning business, as well as in employees and managing partner relationships in the upstream of your supply chain. And then review and documentation policy. How is it going to be monitored and reviewed? Independent sourcing strategy reviews are designed to take an unbiased look at a company's procedures and procurement plans. It identifies the key challenges and issues facing the business and takes all potential risks into account, helping to link strategic goals, operational initiatives, and financial performance. One risk the review will assess is fraud. Procurement fraud is complex. It covers a wide range of illegal activities from bid rigging during the pre-contract award phase through to false invoicing in the post-contract award phase. It can be perpetrated by those inside and outside of an organisation. Procurement fraud is difficult to detect and cases are rarely reported, and subsequently it's difficult to measure the extent of the problem. When fraud is detected, resources generally channeled into investigation and prosecution, which is expensive and rarely ends in conviction or a recovery of the losses. So auditing can be carried out both internally and externally. It takes time and effort and requires someone with the relevant auditing knowledge and skills. An external or third-party auditor is independent and objective and provides accredited certification, training and support. And outsourcing auditing can save an organisation time and resources, which can then be used for internal operations and core functions. You can carry out due diligence when appointing your internal auditor or your independent auditor. Evaluate them to ensure they can provide an appropriate level of service. If the independent third party is used to evaluate the audit, they will identify the strengths of an audit and whether it's designed and detailed enough to suit your compliance purpose. So a compliance audit is a detailed review of organisations' adherence to the regulatory guidance. External sustainability audits are expensive on site because you need to go on site to do inspections to check generally accepted sustainability standards. And again, they're conducted by external specialists. The audits usually refer to the supplier's conformance and performance in relation to codes of conduct or voluntary systems. The assessment will be further tailored by the type of facility under assessment and only relevant sections are covered. External sustainability audits also play an important role in the scheme of supplier development by improving the supplier's sustainability performance. But in addition to the assessment approach, the awareness suppliers have on the code of conduct or standards requirement can be enhanced. So you should start with a kick-off meeting where you brief the scope and methodology. Have a physical inspection of the factory. Interview the employees. review the records, and a final review to discuss potential findings and any corrective actions. The compliance audit function is meant to be reasonable to ensure that the company is complying with all its applicable laws, rules and regulations, as well as any internal codes of conduct, policies and procedures. The internal audit function is designed to monitor and evaluate your internal controls when it comes to the environment and its adequacy, efficiency and effectiveness. Compliance audits mainly play a second line of defence role with corporate governance, but it also has a place in the first line of defence for its own activities, with ownership, responsibility and accountability for directly assessing, controlling and mitigating risks. Internal audits play a third line of defence role within corporate governance, which is more independent than the other two. Internal audit provides an independent assurance of the process and controls in place, not only about the end process owner, but the second line of defence risk management function as well. But finally, compliance must be externally audited to ensure that what they're doing is what they say they're doing. So questions to ask when considering and appointing an independent third party for auditing purposes. What skills and competencies do they have? Do they have sufficient resources? Do they know the industry? What's it going to cost? Will they provide a quality audit? What are their reporting methodologies and scoring? And how will they provide post-audit training? There are a multitude of competencies required by an auditor. Here is just some of them. They need professional ethics to promote and apply professional ethics. In audit management, to develop and manage the audit function. The third is application, to apply the audit framework. Then governance, risk and control, which is to apply a thorough understanding of governance, risk and control that's appropriate to your organisation. In terms of business acumen, they need to be able to maintain expertise of environmental factors, industry practices and specific organisational factors. And communication, so they can communicate with impact. Persuasion and collaboration is to persuade and motivate others through collaboration and cooperation. Critical thinking is to apply process analysis, business intelligence and problem-solving techniques. Audit delivery is to deliver audit engagements professionally. And improvement and innovation is to embrace change and drive improvement and innovation. But you can see there's lots of things on this screen that shows you about the auditor's competence, from being professional, open-minded, decisive, analytical, tenacious, respectful, have a local knowledge and judgment. An effective audit committee isn't simply complying with relevant codes and regulations, but it's a crucial element of governance structure. The committee's role and responsibility will be documented within its terms of reference, which it should review annually and propose to the board for approval. The committee is responsible for systems, processes, reports, data and communications. The committee reviews the results of an audit with the management, including matters required to be communicated to the committee under general accepted auditing standards. While boards should seek members who can provide a diverse range of competence perspectives based on their experience and expertise, it's nevertheless imperative that board members are knowledgeable and conversant in the knowledge of their industry. This need is particularly acute for an audit committee. To achieve aligned sustainability objectives, they must first be clearly communicated across the entire company. Interdepartmental objectives visibly can also help to speed the process of alignment. And by allowing managers to access and see the objectives of other departments, the company can greatly reduce repetition and conflicts throughout the organisation. Accordingly, and additionally, many objectives that are not entirely under the control of one function, you can enable and even mandate that individuals assign some objectives to two or more functions, increasing engagements, sharing accountability, and streamlining the audit process. Objective sharing also helps departmental heads find ways to better support each other, as well as to identify areas where they may be inadvertently working against each other. Consumer awareness and demand for, I suppose they've got demand for environmentally and socially responsible goods, and that's currently important. Global consumers often consider a company's social and environmental commitments before deciding what to buy or where to shop. They expect companies to do more than make a profit, but also to operate responsibly to address the social and environmental issues. The general global population believe that a company's efforts to protect and improve the environment is important for building their trust. Most businesses refer to sales and marketing related benefits when using standards such as improved reputation, contribution to society, and investment opportunities. But here is a summary of the reasons for raising awareness of sustainability standards. It enhances your brand reputation, promotes goodwill and trust, contributes to society, attracts investors, and changes behaviours. Now, due to its impact on the macro environment, media is now a factor added to the traditional environmental analysis, along with the more traditional pestle or steeple factors. Environmental groups are online using social media platforms as a news source, and social media channels are communication systems that allow their social actors to communicate along dyadic ties. But the internet enables less established environmental groups to publish their own information, bypassing journalists' gatekeeping role in which they select and frame stories from a more narrow perspective. In fact, blog platforms were one of the earliest venues for activisms, information dissemination, and environmental discourse. But today, social media channels have expanded the repertoire of communication channels, increasing opportunities for interaction with audiences for these groups. So organisations can make use of media channels, including blogs, to advertise their credentials. And raising awareness of CSR standards, both internally and externally, can help to achieve compliance with standards in order to ensure supply chains act in an ethical and sustainable way. This can lead to improvement in an organisation's reputation, brand image, but also increased profit margins. Employees are internal stakeholders and suppliers are external stakeholders. But all stakeholders, both internally and externally, can affect or be affected by the actions, objectives, and policies of your organisation. So you should encourage your employees to speak to suppliers. Keep them informed of the key initiatives and changes where appropriate. Employees may be the first to know when something goes wrong, so if suppliers are not complying with the regulations or codes of conduct. And employees are key internal stakeholders, and their knowledge can enable us to take action more quickly by using appropriate personnel within the organisation. From an employee's perspective, sustainability initiatives are rarely tied to pay or profit, but rather are intended to combat societal challenges such as climate change. So it's important to provide proper sustainability training to create a feeling of individual responsibility for your employees. These education sessions should evaluate the company's long-term purpose and align them with your employee goals. The approach is undoubtedly more aligned with the will of society and the planet and can help to erase the conflict that people feel between their work duties and their personal values. And by clearly spelling out the economic case for sustainability, employees will begin to think about it more than just doing good, but doing well. And stakeholders are often skeptical about a company's motivations to get involved in sustainability initiatives. Many are persuaded to embrace such initiatives only when convinced the company is sincere about making a positive difference. The corrective action process is a fundamental process that affects all of the control points in a company's management system. Auditors tend to look deeply into a company's corrective action process during their investigations, and that's to better manage the issues that launch the corrective action process. The companies need to optimize their practices by implementing efficient closed-loop corrective action plans. Every good corrective action process should have a built-in process to verify and validate that the corrective action plans is at optimal performance. Root cause analysis is a systematic process for identifying root causes of problems or events and approach to responding to them. But it's based on the basic idea that effective management requires more than merely putting out fires and develop and find new ways to prevent them. So these action plans are a step-by-step action plan to use to resolve issues. The supplier is required to complete the corrective action plan in order to document the error or problem and then address what went wrong by identifying the root cause. For example, during CSR audit, it might become apparent that raw materials supplied by its subcontracting company exploits child labour. They might realise that the clause on subcontracting has been omitted from the contract. So the corrective action could be to amend the contract to include the clause, remind the suppliers of their code of conduct, and undertake reviews to monitor whether the supplier has addressed the issue. The corrective action plan should be included in the procurement process because it focuses the supplier's mind on what caused the error or problem. If non-compliance issues arise, the form can be used to avoid unnecessary argument. If poor performance is identified, it must be addressed as soon as possible. And one way of doing this is through supplier development programs. The buying organisation might give the supplier time to improve, and improvements must be maintained. If there's no improvement, the buying organisation will need to decide whether to continue the relationship with the supplier or exit the relationship and find a new supplier. Alternative dispute resolutions are alternative methods when an independent, objective, and impartial third party provides you with legal disputes to reach an agreement about the dispute by bringing them together and communicating with each other. These have come up as an option for providing cost and time efficiency as compared to judicial proceedings before the courts, and for averting the advantages and disadvantages associated with litigation, but mostly time and cost. Alternative dispute resolutions are optional dispute resolution proceedings, and methods are compared to proceedings at courts. So it's much simpler and faster resolution to the disputes without impairing the judicial sovereignty of the courts. But the main difference between proceedings in the court and ADR is that ADR is a rule, not a binding for a party, so concerned unless otherwise decided by them. Negotiation is the least formal one, less costly, quicker, but it's difficult if the relationship has broken down. Conciliation, fairly informal process, again less costly. Mediation follows conciliation, less costly and quicker. Adjudication is less formal than litigation, but you work with a third-party expert and it's private. And arbitration is more formal, quicker than litigation, but parties have to agree to the third party appointed. So an exit strategy is a pre-planned way of leaving a difficult situation. With an exit strategy in hand at the outset of a supplier relationship, the organisation needs to be and it needs to be incorporated into the contract, ensuring minimum business and customer disruption in the event that the relationship is terminated. These exit strategies should be reviewed annually or when a significant change occurs. The buyer should be aware of any financial requirements related to termination in the terms and conditions of the contract, the rights regarding confidentiality and intellectual property, the security of data and employee rights, such as those covered by 2P, the transfer of undertaking for the protection of employees. But supplier contracts should include the expected standards of service, mutual responsibilities, as well as conditions for termination. Now, these termination clauses should clearly describe when ending a contract may be valid, the length of notice you need to give, and any penalties that may apply if you end the contract early. In the absence of termination clause in the contract, the law will require you to give specific reasonable notice, which is meant to be reasonable depending on your specific circumstances of your supplier's relationship. So, for example, the length of your relationship, the formality, and the current market practice on the duration or negotiation about termination. And that's the end of Learning Outcome 2. Thank you for watching.